A cold winter evening in a small town. Inside the house, 6-year-old Lila cries uncontrollably, her little hands trembling as her stepmother forces a pair of scissors toward her hair, a punishment meant to break her spirit. At that very moment, the front door creaks open. Officer Daniel Ward steps inside, weary from his shift, his boots heavy with snow. By his side, Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, freezes, growling low as his sharp eyes lock onto the scene. In one instant, Daniel realizes the nightmare unfolding in his own home, and his shout will change everything. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city or town in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And may your day be filled with strength, hope, and blessings. The town of Brenton, Vermont, lay heavy under a curtain of late winter frost. Street lamps still glowed in the dim dawn, their amber halos trembling in the cold mist that clung to the cul-de-sac. The clapboard houses looked quiet, their porches rimmed with icicles, but beneath that hush there was the sense of something strained, like a violin string pulled too taut. Snow crunched under the boots of Officer Daniel Ward as he stepped from his police cruiser, Ranger padding close beside him, their shadows stretching in the faint gray light. Daniel was 42 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still carrying the discipline of years in uniform. His short dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his hazel eyes often seemed distant, as though carrying storms no one else could see. To his fellow officers he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who handled night patrols without complaint, but neighbors knew him as quiet, almost too quiet since his first wife died 6 years ago. The grief had sculpted his face with hard lines, yet softened his manner with his daughter, though lately guilt had begun to gnaw at the edges of that softness. Beside him trotted Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Ranger had a thick coat of black and silver fur, amber eyes that glowed with intelligence, and a scar along his right flank from an incident 2 winters ago, when he lunged at a suspect wielding a knife. Fiercely loyal, Ranger had once been a working K-9, trained to track and protect, but since Daniel's early retirement from the K-9 unit, the dog had become both partner and guardian of the Ward household. He was disciplined yet affectionate, watchful with strangers but gentle with children. To Lila, Daniel's only daughter, Ranger was more than a dog. He was a quiet wall of fur and warmth, a living shield. That morning, Daniel returned from a long night shift expecting nothing more than the simple ritual of home, to hang his coat, pour a mug of coffee, maybe hear his daughter's voice carrying through the kitchen. Instead, before his hand even touched the doorknob, a sound cracked through the mist, sharp, piercing, unmistakable. It was the cry of a child. His heart lurched. The cry rose again, words tumbling through sobs. "Mom, please don't cut my hair." Daniel froze, every muscle rigid. Ranger's ears snapped upright, a growl rising low in his throat. On the porch, framed in the dull light, was his second wife, Marjorie. 35 years old, tall and slender, she had once struck him as polished and composed, a woman who carried herself with the elegance of someone used to being noticed. Her blonde hair was styled in precise curls, her lips painted bold red even at dawn. To outsiders, she projected charm, but beneath that varnish was a sharpness Daniel had tried too long to dismiss. She had a habit of measuring people with her blue eyes, as though weighing their usefulness, and when crossed her voice cut, like glass. She had grown up in a household of constant competition, an ambitious father who demanded perfection, a mother who prized appearances above affection, and from that soil, Marjorie had learned to craft a persona that dazzled in public but scalded in private. In her hand now gleamed a pair of scissors. In front of her knelt little Lila, Daniel's 6-year-old daughter. The child had chestnut blonde hair tangled from tears, strands falling into her storm-gray eyes. She was small for her age, with thin arms and a timid posture that made her look even younger. She wore a blue and white cotton dress wrinkled from yesterday's use, her knees red from the cold porch, her small hands gripping the hem of her skirt in desperation. Her voice cracked again. "Mom, please don't cut my hair. I'll be good, I promise." Marjorie's hand tightened on the scissors. "You ruined my dress last night with your clumsiness," she snapped, her voice shrill against the frozen air. "You're going to learn a lesson you'll never forget." Daniel's breath came sharp, his blood pounding in his ears. For a heartbeat, he was too stunned to move. He had ignored the unease that sometimes shadowed Lila's eyes, the way she clung to her teddy bear as though it were armor. He had convinced himself Marjorie was simply strict, but here, before him, the truth was undeniable. His daughter was pleading, and his wife was wielding scissors like a weapon. Ranger reacted first. The dog lunged forward, planting himself between the child and the woman, teeth bared, hackles bristling. His bark exploded through the neighborhood like thunder, echoing off the quiet houses. Marjorie flinched, stepping back, her grip faltering. Daniel surged up the steps, his voice raw. "Marjorie, what the hell are you doing?" He seized the scissors from her hand, his own fingers trembling as he hurled them onto the snow. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by Lila's sobs and Ranger's guttural growl. Then Marjorie's face shifted. The anger drained from her eyes, replaced by a glistening sheen of tears. Her posture softened into frailty. She clasped her hands to her chest as though she were the victim. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you don't understand. I was only trying to discipline her. She needs structure. She's wild without me." Daniel looked at his daughter. Lila's hair was uneven where Marjorie had already snipped, clumps falling onto the icy steps. Her small shoulders shook, and when Ranger pressed his flank against her, she clung to his fur as though to a lifeline. Daniel's chest constricted with shame. He had been blind, too willing to believe the easy lie of order, too unwilling to question what happened in his absence. Across the street, the commotion had drawn neighbors. Mrs. Callahan, a gray-haired widow in her 60s, stood clutching her cardigan, her lips pressed tight. She had lived in Brenton her whole life, known for her garden and her gentle nature, but also for her silence. She had seen hints before, a child standing alone in the yard too long, a voice raised, but fear of meddling kept her quiet. Now her eyes brimmed with guilt as she shook her head. A young father jogging by paused, his toddler babbling in a stroller, but he only muttered, "Poor girl," and kept moving. Their hesitation weighed like a verdict. Daniel bent down, lifting Lila into his arms. She trembled against him, her breath hitching in broken sobs. Ranger stood guard, eyes fixed on Marjorie. Daniel's voice was low, dangerous. "This ends now." Marjorie stepped back, her tears spilling faster, her voice reaching for innocence. "Daniel, please. You can't believe what you saw as the whole truth. She's difficult. She doesn't listen. Enough." His word cut through the morning. He turned away from her, carrying his daughter inside, Ranger following at his heel. Behind them, the neighbors whispered, and the frost-laden air felt fractured, as though the silence of Brenton would never be the same. The morning light grew brighter as the frost began to melt from rooftops. Yet inside the Ward household, the air carried a heaviness that refused to lift. Daniel placed Lila gently onto the worn couch in the living room, her small body trembling as she clutched Ranger's thick fur. The German shepherd stayed close, his amber eyes fixed on the door, his breath visible in the cold draft. The uneven strands of Lila's hair caught the sunlight streaming through the blinds, a visible wound that spoke louder than her sobs. Daniel crouched in front of her, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You're safe now?" he whispered, though the words felt fragile, as if they might shatter under the weight of his guilt. Outside, the neighborhood had already begun buzzing with whispers. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan had not moved from her front steps. She was a small, silver-haired widow in her mid-60s, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, her face lined not only by age, but by years of unspoken regret. She had raised 3 children alone after her husband died in a mill accident, and hardship had taught her resilience, but also fear of interfering in other families' storms. As she stood wringing her hands, she replayed every moment she had noticed the little girl left alone in the yard, shivering in thin clothes, and every time she told herself it was not her place. Now, shame pressed heavily on her, though still her feet would not move closer. From further down the street, a man in his late 30s, Tom Hensley, slowed his jog. He was broad-chested with sandy hair damp from sweat, pushing a stroller in which his toddler daughter babbled softly. Tom worked at a local auto repair shop, known around town as dependable and mild-tempered, but wary of conflict. He saw the scene unfold, saw the scissors flash in Marjorie's hand, saw Ranger's furious bark scatter the silence. He muttered to himself, "Poor kid," then pushed the stroller forward, eyes fixed ahead, convincing himself it was not his fight. Marjorie, meanwhile, stood frozen in the doorway, her face shifting like a mask. Her earlier rage had drained into a calculated expression of sorrow. She clutched her hands together, her posture shrinking, her voice trembling as she called after Daniel. "Please, you don't understand. I only wanted to teach her. She needs discipline." But the neighbor's eyes, once willing to give her the benefit of doubt, now looked away or hardened in judgment. Marjorie's charm, polished and precise, faltered in the face of what had been laid bare. Inside, Daniel straightened, his jaw clenched. He could still hear the echo of his daughter's cry in his ears. The man who had spent his life enforcing the law felt powerless in his own home. He walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside, and caught sight of Mrs. Callahan across the street. Their eyes met for a brief second. She gave the faintest shake of her head, lips pressed, together as though trying to say she was sorry without words. Ranger shifted beside the couch, his body pressed against Lila's knees. The dog's ears twitched at every sound outside, his instincts sharp. He had always been more than a pet. He was a sentinel. At 6 years old, his prime was balanced with maturity. His training from K-9 duty remained intact. He seemed to sense Lila's fragility, lowering his head gently into her lap, anchoring her trembling hands. She buried her fingers in his fur, finding a rhythm that slowed her sobs. Daniel's chest ached. For years he had convinced himself that bringing Marjorie into their lives was the right decision, that Lila needed a maternal figure. He remembered the hollow years after his wife Claire died in a car accident, when Lila was just a toddler clinging to a teddy bear, far too big for her arms. He remembered the loneliness of those nights, how silence pressed so hard on the walls that he thought he might break apart. Marjorie had entered his life like a solution, elegant, composed, offering what looked like stability. Now he saw the truth unraveling strand by strand, like the chopped pieces of his daughter's hair scattered on the porch. From the doorway, Marjorie's voice tried again, smoother now, rehearsed. "Daniel, please. She exaggerates. You know how children are. She broke a glass. She's careless. I only wanted her to remember, so she doesn't repeat it." She stepped forward, her heels tapping against the floorboards. Ranger's growl rumbled, low and steady. His amber eyes locked on her, warning. "Stay back," Daniel snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Marjorie flinched, her hand falling to her side. She tried to summon tears, but they looked thin, insincere. The knock at the front door startled them all. Daniel opened it to find Mrs. Callahan standing there, her cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low, edged with shame. I just wanted to check if the little one is all right," she said. Her gray eyes flicked to Lila on the couch, to the uneven hair, to the scissors still lying discarded on the porch. "I've seen her outside before, in the cold, alone. I should have said something. I didn't." "I'm sorry." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that he should have seen it himself, but all he managed was a stiff nod. "Thank you, Mrs." Callahan Marjorie's face hardened, her tone cutting. "This is our family matter. You have no right." Daniel cut her off with a look that made even Marjorie step back. It stopped being private the moment she cried for help. Mrs. Callahan's lips quivered. She nodded once and turned away, but Daniel could see in her shoulders the weight of years of silence now turned into regret. Back inside, he sat on the couch beside Lila. She leaned into him, her breath slowing, though her eyes stayed wide and wet. He stroked her uneven hair, his hand shaking as he whispered, "You'll never go through that again." Marjorie stood by the wall, her mask cracking, fury flickering beneath the fragile facade. Her voice dropped, almost a hiss. "You'll regret treating me like this, Daniel." But Daniel no longer looked at her. His focus was on his daughter and the German shepherd who refused to leave her side. For the first time in years, he felt a clarity burn through the fog. Nothing would matter more than protecting Lila. The neighbor's silence, the broken trust, even the vows he had made with Marjorie, all of it was secondary now. Ranger thumped his tail once, as though sealing that unspoken vow, and in the quiet that followed, Brenton Street seemed to hold its breath, as though the whole town had just witnessed the first crack in a family's foundation that could no longer be ignored. The evening fell over Brenton with a strange stillness, the kind that pressed against the windows and seeped through the cracks in old wooden frames. The snow that had been hard and glittering in the morning softened into slush along the sidewalks, and mist clung to the rooftops like unspoken secrets. Inside the ward house, the air was warm but tense, every shadow stretched too long beneath the yellow glow of the living room lamp. Daniel sat at the edge of the couch, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on his daughter. Lila was small and fragile in her oversized nightgown, her chestnut blonde hair uneven and jagged, where Marjorie's scissors had torn away chunks. She sat cross-legged on the rug, hugging her teddy bear with a desperation that made her knuckles white. The bear was worn, its once fluffy fur thinned, one button eye a little loose. It had been her mother, Claire's last gift before the accident that ended her life 6 years ago. For Lila, it was not just a toy. It was the closest thing to a shield, a voice of comfort, a silent reminder that she had once been held by a woman who loved her unconditionally. Ranger lay stretched out beside her, his thick silver and black coat rising and falling steadily as he kept watch. Every so often, his amber eyes flicked toward the door, where Marjorie had disappeared hours earlier, pacing upstairs in the bedroom she had claimed as her fortress. The German Shepherd was 6 years old but still powerful, his body taut with muscle and training. He had been bred for discipline, but in moments like this, he seemed more like an older brother guarding a younger sibling. Lila buried her face in his fur, whispering things only he could hear. Daniel leaned forward. "Lila," he said gently, his voice softer than the one he used on the job. "Do you want to talk to me about what happened today?" The little girl shook her head, her storm gray eyes darting toward the stairs. Her voice came out so small it was almost a breath. "She'll hear me." Daniel's chest tightened. He reached out, stroking her tangled hair with fingers that trembled slightly. He wanted to tell her that nothing could harm her anymore, that he would stand like a wall between her and every shadow in this house. But he also knew words, no matter how heavy with love, were too thin when set against years of fear. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady hum of the heater. Ranger shifted his weight, pressing closer to the girl. She clutched the teddy bear harder and whispered into its ear, "Don't let her take you too." Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered nights when Lila was only 3, lying awake with fever, clinging to that same bear, whispering for her mother who could never come back. He had sworn then that he would never let her feel abandoned again. And yet, here they were, the same bear serving as her only anchor while he struggled to hold his family together with hands that felt weaker than he ever imagined. Upstairs, the sound of footsteps echoed, a sharp, impatient rhythm. Marjorie appeared at the top of the stairs, her blonde curls loosened from their careful styling, her blue eyes icy, her silk robe tied too tightly around her waist. She carried herself like a queen scorned, her anger hidden behind an elegant mask. "Daniel," she said coolly, "we need to talk." "Not now," he answered without looking up. Her voice sharpened. "You can't undermine me in front of her. Do you understand? If you make me the enemy, you destroy this family." Ranger rose to his feet with a low growl. Lila shrank against him, clutching both the bear and his fur. Daniel stood slowly, his broad shoulders tense. "Marjorie, you destroyed this family when you raised scissors to a child. Don't speak of unity when all you bring is fear." Her eyes flashed, then softened, her voice turning syrupy sweet. "You don't understand, Daniel. I was raised in a home where mistakes were punished, where discipline meant survival. My father demanded perfection, and I turned out strong because of it. I only want Lila to grow strong too." Daniel's gaze hardened. "You confuse cruelty with strength." The silence stretched heavy, Marjorie's lips pressed thin, her mask slipping, and without another word, she retreated upstairs, slamming the door. Later that night, Daniel tucked Lila into bed. The uneven light from the lamp fell across her small face as she clung to her teddy bear, refusing to release it even when sleep threatened. Ranger curled at the foot of the bed, his body a barricade against the world. Daniel sat beside her, brushing her hair back. She whispered, "Daddy, can I keep my bear always?" She said, "I didn't deserve it." Daniel felt his throat burn. "You'll always have it. No one can take it from you. Not while I'm here." Her eyes closed slowly, her breaths evening out, though her small fingers never let go of the bear. Downstairs, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee untouched in front of him. Memories pressed into his chest. How Marjorie had seemed perfect when he met her at a community fundraiser 2 years ago. How he thought she could bring warmth into the hollow spaces Claire left behind. He remembered Sarah Monroe, Claire's best friend and fellow officer, warning him not to rush. Sarah was a tall, lean woman with piercing brown eyes and a calm that came from years of patrolling rough neighborhoods. Life had hardened her edges, but not her heart. She had lost her brother to opioid addiction, and since then she had carried a deep mistrust of anything that looked too polished, too good to be true. She had told Daniel, "Grief makes us reach for shadows, but shadows don't fill the light." He had ignored her then. Now her words returned like an indictment. The clock ticked past midnight. Daniel rose, climbed the stairs, and paused outside the bedroom door where Marjorie had shut herself away. He almost entered, almost demanded answers, but instead turned back toward his daughter's room. Inside, Ranger stirred but did not rise, his eyes tracking Daniel with quiet loyalty. Lila was still asleep, curled tightly around her bear, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm fragile yet steady. Daniel whispered to himself, "I won't fail you again." He sat in the chair beside her bed until dawn began to bleed gray into the sky, his body heavy, his heart heavier, his vow echoing silently with the hum of Ranger's breath and the soft creak of the old house. The next morning broke gray and brittle over Brenton. A thin sheet of ice glazed the streets and the wind moved through the bare trees with a restless whisper. Daniel pulled on his uniform, the familiar weight of the badge against his chest, feeling heavier than usual. In the kitchen, the faint smell of burnt toast lingered, his failed attempt at making breakfast for Lila before sending her off to school. She had clung to her teddy bear on the ride, silent, but watching the world slip by the car window with eyes too old for her age. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, his body tense, amber eyes tracking every passerby as if no one could be trusted anymore. At the station, Daniel tried to focus on routine, paperwork, reports, calls from residents, all of it blurred into white noise. His mind replayed the image of his daughter kneeling on the porch, scissors flashing too close to her face. He pushed the memory down, focusing instead on a new case file that had appeared on his desk, a data leak in the narcotics division. Sensitive details about undercover operations had been accessed during his last night shift. The system log showed his account credentials used at odd hours, even while he had been patrolling the far end of town. His brows knit. He prided himself on discipline, never sloppy with his work. He called over the department's IT officer, Ethan Clark, a lanky man in his late 20s with short blonde hair, glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, and a mind sharp as a blade when it came to digital trails. Ethan spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another, his nervous energy always present. "Look here, Dan. Your login was used at 1:14 a.m., but according to patrol records you were across town. Someone with physical access must have used it." Daniel's stomach tightened. His home computer was linked to the department's system, a privilege given to officers with long service. He remembered evenings when Marjorie would linger behind his desk, pretending to bring him coffee, asking questions about his work. He had dismissed it then as curiosity, but now the suspicion gnawed at him. He leaned closer. "Can you trace where the login came from?" Ethan nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Working on it." But whoever it was knew what they were doing. Covered their tracks well, Daniel left the station with a storm building in his chest. Driving home, he noticed the subtle details he had ignored before. Neighbors avoiding his eyes, the way the world seemed to hold its breath around his house. He pulled into the driveway, Ranger's ears already pricking at the tension in the air. Inside, Marjorie was sitting at the kitchen table, dressed immaculately as if for a social gathering rather than a quiet morning. A silk blouse hugged her frame, her hair perfectly curled. She looked up with a smile too polished, her blue eyes shimmering like glass. "Daniel," she purred, "you're home early. Want me to make you lunch?" He ignored the offer, his gaze falling on an envelope lying neatly on the counter. No stamp, no return address. He opened it with steady hands, though his pulse raced. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough. Marjorie sitting across from Victor Hale, a man Daniel recognized instantly. Hale was in his 40s, with slick black hair, a strong jaw, and a reputation as the director of a private security firm that often skirted legality. His eyes in the photos looked hungry, calculating, the kind of man who saw people as pawns. The images showed Marjorie leaning close, speaking with intensity, her hand brushing his arm. The kind of meeting that left no room for innocence. Daniel laid the photos on the table, his voice low. "Explain this." Marjorie's face blanched, then hardened. She let out a brittle laugh. "You're paranoid." It was a business meeting, nothing more. Hale's company was offering security consultation for our home. I wanted to surprise you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He had heard many lies in his career, and this one was weak. He said nothing, only stared, his silence heavier than any words. Ranger padded into the room, his body tense, a growl vibrating in his chest as though he too smelled deceit. Marjorie pushed back from the table, her composure cracking. "What? You don't trust me now? After everything I've given up for this house? For you?" Her voice rose, sharp with venom. "Maybe you should be grateful someone actually wants to stand beside a man still haunted by a dead wife." The words struck deep, but Daniel did not flinch. He had learned to let pain harden into resolve. He turned, heading toward Lila's room, the photographs clutched in his fist. Ranger followed close, casting one last glare at Marjorie before disappearing down the hallway. That night, after Lila had fallen asleep with her teddy bear tucked under her chin and Ranger guarding the foot of her bed, Daniel sat alone in his study. The photos lay spread across the desk, the flickering desk lamp painting them in harsh light. He traced each image with his eyes, the betrayal carving into him deeper than any blade. Not only had Marjorie harmed his daughter, but now there was reason to believe she had slipped into his world of duty and law, dragging with her a man like Victor Hale. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah Monroe. She had heard whispers at the station about the leak, and her voice was steady, but concerned. "Dan, whatever's happening, you need to watch your back. Hale's name is circling with things that could end careers, or worse. Don't let your guard down at home, not with Lila there." Daniel closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the phone. Sarah had always been direct, her tall frame and sharp gaze giving her presence weight even before she spoke. She was not just a colleague, but one of the few people who had known Claire, his late wife, in life and in laughter. Her voice now carried the echo of that old loyalty. "Thanks, Sarah," he said hoarsely. "I'll handle it." When the call ended, he leaned back, his mind burning. He realized that his battle was no longer just for custody of his daughter, nor only against a cruel stepmother. This was about betrayal that stretched into the very fabric of his duty, his integrity as a police officer. And if Victor Hale was involved, it meant danger lurked far beyond his own walls. Upstairs, he heard the faint creak of a floorboard, Marjorie moving restlessly in her room. Daniel gathered the photos into a folder, locking them in his desk drawer. He walked softly to his daughter's room, pausing at the doorway. Lila stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, still clutching her teddy bear. Ranger raised his head, eyes glowing in the dim light, before resting it back on his paws. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, "I won't let her lose more than she already has." The vow filled the silence, sharper than steel, carried only by the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing, and the quiet heartbeat of the dog who never left her side. The winter sky over Brenton had turned pale and brittle, the kind of gray that seemed to press against the earth rather than hang above it. The Ward house sat quiet, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. Inside, Daniel moved through the kitchen like a man carrying invisible chains. He brewed coffee but forgot to drink it, stared at the refrigerator but forgot what he meant to take. His mind was still wrapped around the photographs of Marjorie and Victor Hale, every detail replayed, her leaning forward, her hand brushing Hale's arm, the look in Hale's eyes. The betrayal clung to him like frost. In the living room, Lila sat on the couch, her teddy bear wedged tightly under her chin. Ranger lay stretched beside her, his head resting on her knees, his eyes glowing amber in the soft light. The dog seemed to sense the fragility of the moment, his body motionless except for the occasional flick of his ear. Lila's hair, uneven and jagged from the scissors, framed her pale face. She was quiet, too quiet for a child her age. Daniel sat beside her, lowering his broad frame onto the couch. He was still in uniform, his holster pressing into his hip, his badge catching the light. He looked at his daughter, his voice steady but tender. "Lila, I need you to tell me the truth. Has Marjorie hurt you before?" Her lips pressed together, her small hands squeezing the teddy bear so tightly the button eyes strained. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with her gaze fixed on Ranger, she whispered, "She locked me outside. Even when it snowed, she said I wasn't good enough to hold my bear. She said I had to stand alone until I learned." Daniel's chest clenched. He tried to swallow, but his throat burned. He reached out, laying a hand on her back. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Her storm-gray eyes flicked toward him, wide and afraid. "She said you'd believe her, that you'd think I was lying. And she said if I told, she'd take Ranger away." At the sound of his name, Ranger lifted his head and gave a low, protective growl, as if affirming his loyalty. Daniel felt his vision blur, his fists curling against his knees. His daughter had been suffering in silence under his own roof. His failure was now undeniable. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. "I should have seen it. But I promise you, Lila, from now on, no one will ever hurt you again." She leaned into him, burying her face in his uniform, the teddy bear wedged between them. Daniel held her close, one arm wrapping around her, the other resting over Ranger's strong shoulders. The three of them formed a fragile circle of trust that he vowed never to let break again. The next day at the station, Daniel sought out Sarah Monroe. She stood near the bulletin board, scanning case notes. At nearly 6 feet tall, Sarah carried herself with quiet authority. Her lean frame spoke of years of patrol, her dark brown hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her sharp eyes missed little, yet beneath that steel lay a heart known for loyalty and fairness. She had once been Claire's closest friend, spending late nights in the ward home, helping with baby Lila when Daniel was on shift. Losing Claire had carved something deep in her too, and since then, she had treated Lila almost like her own niece. Daniel waited until the hallway was empty, then handed her the folder of photographs. "These came to my house." Sarah flipped through them, her jaw tightening. "That's Hale. And if your wife," she caught herself correcting. "If Marjorie is meeting him, this isn't just personal, Dan. Hale's name has been circling in connection with smuggling routes. You might be sleeping beside a liability." Daniel exhaled hard, the weight of her words pressing deeper. "It's worse. Lila told me everything. The abuse." The threats to Sarah's eyes softened, though her voice stayed firm. "Then you can't wait. You need to file for divorce and custody now. And if Hale's involved, you need to report it higher up." "I can't risk Lila getting dragged into a storm bigger than she can handle," Daniel muttered. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Her grip was strong, steady. "You don't get to choose the storm, Dan. You only get to choose how you stand in it." Her words struck, the same way they always had when they worked patrol together, direct, cutting through his hesitation. He nodded, though the knot in his chest remained. That evening, Daniel picked Lila up from school. Her teacher, Karen Doyle, a petite woman in her early 30s with auburn hair and a gentle voice, stopped him at the gate. "Mr. Ward," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. "Lila's been falling asleep in class. I've noticed bruises on her arms. When I asked, she said she tripped, but it didn't sound right." "I think you should know," Daniel forced a nod, though his stomach churned. "I know. Thank you, Miss Doyle. I'll take care of it." Driving home, Lila sat quietly in the back seat, Ranger pressed against her side. Daniel caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of relief there, as though the truth she had finally spoken out loud had lifted some invisible weight. That night, after dinner, Daniel sat with his daughter at the kitchen table. The teddy bear sat between them, its button eye watching like a silent witness. Lila's voice trembled as she asked, "Daddy, will she come back?" Daniel leaned forward, his hand covering hers. "She won't be able to hurt you anymore." "I'll make sure of it," Ranger thumped his tail, the sound like punctuation to the vow. As the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows of the Ward home, Daniel knew his path had changed. This was no longer about patching cracks in a broken family. It was about protection, justice, and redemption. And it began with believing in the small, trembling truth of a child who had finally dared to speak. The courthouse in Brenton stood like an old sentinel on Main Street, its stone facade weathered by decades of harsh winters. On that morning, the air outside was sharp and dry, the kind of cold that burned the lungs when breathed too quickly. Daniel walked up the stone steps, his uniform pressed, his broad shoulders squared, though inside his chest a storm brewed. At his side, padded Ranger, the German shepherd's silver and black coat brushed by the wind, amber eyes scanning every corner. The dog's presence drew quiet murmurs from onlookers gathered outside, some nodding with respect, others simply curious. Behind Daniel, little Lila clutched her teddy bear to her chest, her storm-gray eyes darting nervously toward the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old paper. The benches were lined with townsfolk who had heard whispers of what had unfolded at the Ward home. Some came out of sympathy, others out of the small-town hunger for spectacle. The judge presiding was Patricia Coleman, a woman in her early 60s with a silver crown of hair coiled into a bun, her black robe fitting her tall frame with severity. She was known for her calm but unyielding presence, a judge who believed fairness required both discipline and compassion. Her clear blue eyes studied people with patience, yet carried an edge that cut through lies like glass. Marjorie entered, her appearance as carefully crafted as ever. She wore a fitted gray suit, her blonde curls sculpted, her lips painted in a soft pink, meant to inspire pity rather than power. She walked with the air of a woman convinced she could control perception, her chin lifted, her eyes darting toward Daniel as if to test his weakness. Daniel took his seat at the petitioner's table, Sarah Monroe at his side. She had agreed to support him, as both a colleague and a witness. Sarah's tall, lean frame filled the chair with a quiet strength, her dark brown hair tied neatly back, her sharp eyes locked on the proceedings. She wore no uniform today, only a dark blazer over a crisp shirt, but her presence radiated authority. Her loyalty to Daniel's late wife gave her testimony moral weight, and she intended to use it fully. The first witness called was Mrs. Callahan. She walked slowly, her wool cardigan wrapped tight around her small shoulders, her face pale but resolute. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but every word carried decades of withheld guilt. I saw the girl outside in the cold more than once. Hours, sometimes. She cried, but I did nothing. I regret that. But what I saw that morning on the porch, that was no discipline. That was cruelty. She glanced toward Lila, then lowered her gaze in shame. The second was Karen Doyle, the teacher. Petite, with auburn hair framing her gentle face, she spoke clearly, though her eyes often flicked toward Lila in concern. Alice, Lila has been falling asleep in class. I noticed bruises. When I asked, she forced a smile, but it was the kind of smile children wear when they're afraid. I believe she was living in fear at home. As the words settled, Marjorie shifted in her seat, her face twisting into an expression of disbelief. They're exaggerating, she hissed to her attorney, but her protest carried no weight. Then came Sarah. She rose, her tall frame commanding attention. Her voice was calm, deliberate. I have known Daniel Ward for 15 years. I served alongside him. I also knew his first wife, Claire. She loved their daughter with a devotion that shaped who Lila is. When Claire died, Daniel carried that grief, but he never failed his child. When Marjorie entered his life, I cautioned him not to rush. My fears are, unfortunately, realized now. I stand here not as an officer, but as someone who has seen firsthand the impact of neglect and fear. Lila deserves safety, not discipline through humiliation. The courtroom fell into silence after Sarah's words. Even Judge Coleman paused, her pen resting as her eyes lingered on Lila. Then came the moment everyone waited for. Daniel bent down, whispering to his daughter. Lila clutched her teddy bear tighter, then nodded. Together, father and daughter walked to the front. Ranger padded close, his body a silent shadow of protection. The sight of the German shepherd beside the little girl sent a ripple through the gallery. Loyalty incarnate, a guardian on 4 legs. Judge Coleman leaned forward, her voice softer than before. "Child, you don't need to say much. Only what you want. No one here will hurt you." Lila's lips trembled. She looked up at her father, who gave her the smallest nod. Then she spoke, her voice faint but steady. "All I ever wanted was a mom. But she said I didn't deserve my bear. She said I was worthless." I was so scared she buried her face against her father's sleeve as the last words spilled out. Gasps echoed across the room. Ranger pressed his body closer to Lila, releasing a soft whine as though to comfort her. Marjorie shot up from her chair, her voice rising in shrill protest. "She's lying! She hated me from the start. I was only trying to raise her right." Judge Coleman's gavel struck once, sharp and echoing. "Mrs. Ward, you will sit. If you interrupt again, you will be removed." Marjorie collapsed back into her chair, her mask slipping, her eyes darting around the courtroom in desperation. Daniel held his daughter tighter, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with both sorrow and fury. He kissed her hair, uneven as it was, and whispered so only she could hear, "You're safe now. Daddy's here." When the hearing paused for recess, Daniel carried Lila out of the courtroom, Ranger leading the way. The hallway outside was quieter, filled only with the low murmur of townsfolk. Sarah followed, her long stride quickening to match his. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing bringing her truth into the open. No one can take that back now." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He looked down at his daughter curled against him, teddy bear pressed between them, Ranger brushing against his leg. For the first time in years, despite the weight of betrayal and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, he felt a glimmer of something stronger than fear. It was the beginning of justice. The afternoon sun spilled weakly through the courthouse windows, gilding the polished banisters in muted gold. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys scattered across Brenton. People drifted down the courthouse steps in murmurs, some shaking their heads in sympathy, others whispering gossip about the trial they had just witnessed. Daniel exited slowly, his broad frame hunched slightly as though the weight of testimony still pressed on his shoulders. Lila clung to his hand, her small body half hidden in the folds of his navy coat, the teddy bear wedged under her arm. Ranger moved close to them, his muscles taut, eyes alert, as if sensing that the echoes of conflict had followed them into the daylight. Sarah Monroe walked at Daniel's side, her tall frame commanding, her sharp gaze fixed on the crowd. Out of uniform, she still moved with the disciplined stride of a veteran officer, every step measured, every glance calculated. She had always carried the kind of strength forged not by ease, but by loss. The death of her younger brother had hardened her resolve years ago, leaving her unwilling to tolerate injustice in any form. She touched Daniel's arm lightly, her voice low but steady. "You did what needed to be done." Lila spoke her truth. "That matters." Daniel nodded, though his jaw tightened. Truth doesn't always stop the storm. Before Sarah could reply, Ranger stiffened, his ears pricked, his amber eyes narrowing at a figure standing near the end of the courthouse steps. It was a man, tall, mid-40s, with dark hair slicked neatly back and a long black coat falling past his knees. His face was angular, handsome in a cold way, with eyes that glimmered like obsidian. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to control. Daniel's chest clenched. Victor Hale. Though Hale had never been convicted, whispers about his dealings traveled through every law enforcement channel in Vermont. He was the head of a private security firm that masked operations many suspected involved trafficking and cybercrime. To the public, he was polished, philanthropic even, donating to local charities. To men like Daniel, he was a vulture in human form. Hale smiled thinly, his gaze lingering on Daniel before drifting down to Lila. The girl instinctively pressed closer to her father, her small hand tightening its grip on his. Ranger's growl rolled through the air like distant thunder, low and menacing. Sarah stepped forward, her tall frame a barrier. "You don't belong here, Hale." He raised a hand in mock surrender, his voice smooth as silk. "I was merely passing by. The town is small, Word of your family difficulties travels quickly. I thought I'd offer my sympathies." His smile widened, but his eyes stayed fixed on Lila, a predator's gaze disguised as politeness. Daniel's voice came out like gravel. "If you so much as breathe in her direction again, I'll bury you under every charge I can find." Hale tilted his head, unfazed. "Such hostility, Officer Ward. Perhaps you should ask yourself who benefits from tearing families apart. Some scars never heal." His words hung like poison before he turned, disappearing into the street crowd with deliberate calm. Lila's body trembled. Ranger pressed his flank against her, his growl fading into a protective whine as she buried her face in his fur. Daniel lifted her into his arms, his eyes burning with fury. He whispered against her hair, "I won't let him touch you." Not now, not ever. That evening, back at the Ward home, the quiet returned but felt fragile, as though one sharp sound might break it. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his head bowed into his hands. Sarah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "He wanted you to see him," she said flatly. "That was no coincidence? He's testing you, seeing how far he can push before you break." Daniel's voice was hoarse. "He's already taken too much. I can't let him use Marjorie as his weapon. Not with Lila in the middle." From the living room came the soft sound of crayons scratching paper. Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, Ranger stretched beside her, the teddy bear propped against the dog's flank like a silent sentinel. She was drawing, a window with two figures inside, one large, one small, and outside the window, a shadow with sharp edges. She pressed the crayon hard, her small hand trembling. Sarah walked over, crouching beside the girl. "That's a strong picture," she said softly, her voice warmer now. "You're brave for putting your fear on paper?" Lila looked up, storm-gray eyes uncertain. "Will the shadow go away?" Sarah glanced toward Daniel before answering. "Shadows can't live where there's light. And you, Lila, are stronger than any shadow." The girl gave a faint nod, returning to her drawing, Ranger's head lowering protectively near her lap. Later that night, when the house had grown quiet, Daniel stood at the front window, watching snow drift lazily under the street lamp. Sarah approached, her voice quiet. "You need allies, Dan. You can't fight Hale and Marjorie alone. If he's bold enough to show up in public, he's bold enough to try worse in private." Daniel's eyes didn't move from the window. "I know. But who do I trust when my own home's been poisoned?" "You start with the ones who've proven themselves," she answered simply. Her gaze flicked toward Lila's bedroom door, where faint lamplight glowed. Her, and the dog who'd give his life for her. Daniel managed a weary smile. "And you." Sarah's lips curved in the smallest acknowledgement. "And me." At that moment, Ranger barked, sharp and sudden, his paws striking the floorboards. Daniel rushed to the door, yanking it open just as headlights flashed briefly before a car sped away down the street. In. The yard lay a brick wrapped in paper, the words scrawled in the thick black ink. "Stay out, or you'll regret it." Daniel's blood turned cold. He picked up the brick, his jaw tight. Ranger barked again, teeth bared, the sound tearing through the night like a warning bell. Upstairs, Lila stirred, her frightened voice calling out. Daniel carried the brick inside, laying it on the table, his hands trembling with both rage and resolve. Sarah looked at him, her eyes steady. "This isn't just a custody fight anymore. This is a war, and Hale doesn't bluff." Daniel glanced toward Ranger, who stood planted, muscles taut, ready for whatever came next. Then he looked at Lila, now standing at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, teddy bear clutched tight, eyes wide with fear. He lifted her into his arms, whispering fiercely, "No matter what he tries, you're safe. Because I'll fight until my last breath." And in the dim glow of the Ward home, with Ranger standing like a sentinel and Sarah watching like a hawk, Daniel knew the storm was far from over. But for the first time, he also knew he would not face it alone. The next morning dawned bleak over Brenton, the sky a flat iron gray. Frost clung stubbornly to the sidewalks, and the air carried a biting chill that hinted of snow to come. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. The brick from the night before still lay on the table, wrapped in its threatening note. its presence like an intruder in the house. Ranger sat nearby, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the window, as though expecting another attack. Lila was upstairs still asleep, curled beneath her quilt with her teddy bear pressed tight against her chest, unaware of the depth of the storm brewing outside her small world. Sarah had stayed the night, refusing to leave Daniel and Lila alone after the warning. She now stood in the doorway, her tall frame outlined by the dim morning light, arms crossed over her chest. Her brown eyes were steady, though beneath them, faint shadows revealed the toll of years in law enforcement. She had always been known for her endurance, for pushing through exhaustion when others faltered, but Daniel could read the fatigue in her posture. Still, she would never admit it. "We need to take that brick to evidence," she said quietly. "Get it logged officially. If Hale wants to play intimidation, he's already overplayed his hand." Daniel nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Part of me wants to storm into his office and end this face to face." "And that's exactly what he wants," Sarah replied sharply. "He thrives on provoking rash decisions. You have to outthink him, not outpunch him." Before Daniel could answer, his phone buzzed. The caller ID read Detective Maria Santos. Maria was from the county's major crimes division, a woman in her late 30s with olive-toned skin, jet black hair tied into a severe bun, and eyes like dark steel. She had built her reputation on dismantling organized crime rings, known for her relentless pursuit of evidence and her refusal to bow to pressure. Daniel answered quickly, his voice taut. "Ward." Maria's tone was clipped but urgent. "We intercepted chatter last night, linking Victor Hale to a string of data breaches across the county. Your name came up. More specifically, your home system." Daniel's gut clenched. "You're saying he's been inside my house?" "Not physically, but through access granted by someone close to you. I don't have to spell out who. If you've got any evidence tying your wife to Hale, now's the time to hand it over." Daniel's eyes flicked to the desk drawer, where the photos were locked away. He felt Sarah's gaze on him, solid and unflinching. "I'll bring them," he said. After hanging up, he pulled the folder free and laid the photographs on the table. Sarah leaned over, her sharp eyes scanning them once more. "This is more than family betrayal," she said grimly. "She's compromised your career, your oath, and your daughter's safety all at once." Later that day, Daniel drove to the county offices with Sarah beside him and Ranger pacing in the back seat. At the station, Maria met them in the lobby. She was tall, dressed in a fitted black blazer and slacks, her movements precise. She took the folder from Daniel, flipping through each photo with methodical care. "This," she said, "combined with the system logs Ethan Clark provided, will be enough to tie Hale and Marjorie together. But I need more if we're going to bring charges strong enough to hold in court." Daniel frowned. "What kind of more?" Maria's eyes narrowed. "Financials, transfers. If she's been feeding Hale information, she didn't do it for free. There will be money, gifts, something tangible. We dig there, we tie the noose." Sarah crossed her arms, her tall frame leaning against the desk. "And while we're digging, Hale will keep pressing. He already threw a brick at their house. What happens when he escalates?" Maria's eyes softened just slightly, though her voice remained firm. "Then, we keep your daughter under protection. I'll assign a plainclothes unit to watch the house, but you know as well as I do, nothing protects her better than that dog of yours and a father who won't bend." Back at the Ward home, Daniel tried to restore some normalcy for Lila. He sat with her at the table as she colored, Ranger stretched at her feet, but she was distracted, glancing often at the window. Finally, she asked in a whisper, "Daddy, will the man in the black coat come back?" Daniel reached across the table, resting his broad hand over her smaller one. "If he does, he'll have to get through me. And Ranger, and your Aunt Sarah." Lila's lips quivered, but she gave a small nod. Ranger lifted his head, resting it in her lap, and she stroked his fur slowly. That evening, Sarah cooked a simple meal, pasta with tomato sauce, and the house smelled of garlic and simmering herbs. It was a rare domestic moment for a woman who usually lived off takeout between shifts. Daniel watched her move in the kitchen, her lean frame steady, her hands precise even in mundane tasks. He realized how long it had been since his house had held such ordinary warmth. After dinner, as Lila drifted off to sleep, Sarah spoke quietly in the living room. "You know she's going to remember every detail of this, Dan. The scissors, the porch, the bear. But what will matter most is how you stood for her now. That's what will stay. Daniel rubbed his forehead, exhaustion dragging at him. What if standing isn't enough? Hale plays a game where the rules don't exist. Sarah leaned forward, her sharp gaze unwavering. Then we make our own rules. He's not untouchable, Dan. Men like him think fear is armor, but fear cracks when you shine a light long enough. Before Daniel could respond, Ranger barked sharply from the front door, his body rigid. Daniel rushed forward, pulling it open. A plain white envelope lay on the porch. Inside, a single sheet of paper carried only 6 words in bold black ink. You can't protect her forever. Daniel's hands shook as he crumpled the note. Sarah stood behind him, her tall frame casting a long shadow, her voice steady. Then, we make sure forever starts tonight. And in that moment, with the German shepherd growling low at his side and his daughter sleeping upstairs, Daniel understood that the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about outlasting Hale, outthinking him, and building a future where Lila's fear would finally give way to peace. Snow began to fall over Brenton in delicate flurries, coating the town in a deceptive calm. From the outside, the Ward home looked like any other, smoke rising from the chimney, warm light flickering through frosted windows. But inside, tension ran like a live wire. The brick and the letter from Hale had not left Daniel's mind, their weight settling like stones in his chest. He sat at the dining table, the note unfolded in front of him, while Ranger lay near his boots, his ears pricked, and his amber eyes fixed on every sound beyond the walls. Sarah Monroe had stayed again, her tall frame moving quietly through the kitchen as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. She was dressed plainly, dark jeans, a simple sweater, but her presence carried its usual weight, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as though cataloging every exit, every risk. Years in law enforcement had wired her that way. "You're thinking yourself into a corner," she said, placing the mug in front of him. Daniel rubbed a hand across his face. He's not backing down. Hale doesn't just want information. He wants control, and he's using Marjorie to get it. Before Sarah could answer, Daniel's phone buzzed. The name flashing on the screen was Michael Turner, a seasoned attorney he had contacted through Sarah's recommendation. Turner was in his early 50s, tall and slightly stooped, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Known in the county for his meticulous preparation, he was not flashy, but his steady voice carried weight in every courtroom he entered. "Mr. Ward," Turner began, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We've traced several financial transactions linked to your wife's account. Large deposits from shell companies tied to Hale's firm. This is the proof we needed." Daniel's pulse quickened. "How strong is it?" "Strong enough," Turner said. "The court will see the connection. Combined with her actions against your daughter, it paints a clear picture of motive and character. But we must act quickly. Hale will know the walls are closing in." After the call, Daniel looked at Sarah. She arched an eyebrow. "Then it's time to tighten the net." That afternoon, Daniel met Turner at his office. The attorney's space was filled with heavy oak furniture and stacks of neatly organized case files. A faint smell of old paper and leather lingered in the air. Turner slid a file across the desk. Inside were printouts of wire transfers, bank statements, and photographs of Marjorie meeting Hale at different locations. Cafes, hotel lobbies, even the parking lot of a private airstrip outside town. Turner leaned back, steepling his fingers. She's been feeding him information for months. "Look here, these payments coincide exactly with the breaches Detective Santos identified. This isn't just betrayal of marriage, Mr. Ward. This is conspiracy." Daniel stared at the evidence, his jaw. Tightening betrayal had moved from whispers and suspicion into undeniable fact. As Daniel left the office, snow was falling harder, coating the streets in white. Lila was waiting back home with Sarah, Ranger never straying more than a step from her side. She had begun drawing more lately, sketches of houses, trees, and always 2 animals side by side, a bear and a dog. That night, she proudly showed Daniel a new drawing, this one with the bear and dog standing in front of a house, guarding it. "They don't let the shadows in," she whispered. Daniel felt something break and mend inside his chest all at once. He kissed her hair and said softly, "That's right. They never will." But the storm was not done. Just after midnight, headlights flared outside the Ward home. Ranger sprang up, barking with a ferocity that rattled the windows. Daniel rushed to the door, his service weapon in hand, Sarah right behind him. A car idled at the curb, its engine rumbling. Through the fogged windshield, Daniel saw a figure watching. The car peeled away before he could step outside, tires hissing against the snow. Sarah cursed under her breath. "He's circling, testing your nerves." Daniel tightened his grip on the weapon, his hazel eyes burning. "Then he'll learn mine don't break." The next morning, Detective Maria Santos arrived, her black hair tied in its usual severe bun, her sharp eyes glinting with focus. She examined the letter, the photos, the financial records Turner had compiled. "This is enough to indict both Hale and Marjorie," she said firmly. "But we need to keep your daughter safe until the case moves forward. That means close surveillance and absolute vigilance. If Hale suspects he's losing, he'll lash out." Daniel looked toward Lila's room, where faint laughter drifted, the sound of Ranger playing tug-of-war with her teddy bear. It was a fragile laugh, but it was laughter nonetheless. He turned back to Maria, his jaw set. "Then we stand guard." That evening, the house was quieter than usual, but a new kind of strength threaded through its silence. Sarah sat near the fireplace. Her long frame relaxed for once, though her eyes remained watchful. Daniel sat beside Lila as she colored, her storm-gray eyes calmer now, her hand steady as she sketched a sun rising over the bear and the dog. Ranger lay close, head resting on his paws, his amber eyes watching the door. Outside, the snow fell heavy, blanketing the world in white. But inside the Ward home, for the first time in weeks, warmth outshone fear. Every story like this reminds us that even in the darkest moments, God places small miracles in our path. Sometimes it is a loyal dog standing guard, sometimes a brave child finding her voice, and sometimes a father choosing to protect what truly matters. These are not just stories. They are lessons for our everyday lives. We are called to notice the quiet ways God works around us, to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves, and to believe that hope is never lost. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others who need encouragement. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, and let us know what moment gave you hope. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss a story of courage and faith. And if you believe in God's miracles, type Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and light in your days ahead.